Hey guys, tonight we're drifting out onto cold, dark water. So go ahead, dim the lights, pull the blanket a little tighter, and let's talk about one of the most haunting shipwrecks in modern history. The story of the Edmund Fitzgerald, a ship that was supposed to be unsinkable, too strong to fail, and way too modern to vanish into a storm. But of course, it did. Because that's how these stories always go. It's been 50 years now, half a century since the Fitzgerald disappeared into Lake Superior, taking all 29 crewmen with it. No survivors, no distress call, and for decades, no clear answer why. Just a lot of theories, fragments of wreckage, and a haunting ballad that made sure no one ever forgot her name. Let's take this slowly, like the roll of waves against the hull. Lake Superior, November 10, 1975. It was one of those early winter nights that felt heavier than it should. The kind of night where the air tastes metallic, and you can almost sense something watching from the horizon. Superior is the largest freshwater lake on Earth, but more than that, it's the most temperamental. The native Ojibwe called it Gichigami, the Great Sea, beautiful, dangerous, and famously unforgiving. Mariners knew what that meant. Every sailor on the Great Lakes did. Superior could turn from calm to chaos in less than an hour, and in November, storms there were called witches. Not in a poetic way, more in a you-might-not-come-back way. The Edmund Fitzgerald wasn't supposed to be one of those unlucky ships. When it launched in 1958, it was the biggest thing on the lakes, 729 feet long, sleek, and shining like a floating skyscraper. It was the pride of the Great Lakes shipping industry. Its owner, Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company, yes, the same kind of company that sells boring retirement plans, wanted something impressive to name after their board chairman, Edmund Fitzgerald. So they built this steel behemoth to haul iron ore pellets, taconite if you want the fancy term, from mines in Minnesota down to steel mills near Detroit. The Fitzgerald could carry over 26,000 tons of it at once, which is like floating an entire small town made of metal. And she looked good doing it. Her nickname among sailors was the pride of the American side, which, in hindsight, makes her story sound even sadder. The ship's captain in 1975 was Ernest McSorley, a man who'd been on the lakes longer than most people had been alive. Experienced, steady, the kind of captain you trusted to get you home. This was supposed to be his last season before retirement. Of course it was. Because if history has a sense of humor, it's a dark one. On November 9th, the Fitzgerald loaded up in Superior, Wisconsin, with 26,000 tons of iron ore and began its trip east toward Detroit. Another ship, the Arthur M. Anderson, departed not long after on the same route. The two kept in radio contact, standard procedure, especially with a storm warning brewing. At first, things seemed manageable. The waves were choppy, but not impossible. Winds around 35 knots, gusting higher. Nothing McSorley hadn't handled before. But then came November 10th, and the Witch of November arrived for real. By early afternoon, waves had grown to 25 feet. Winds screamed past 50 knots. Snow and spray made visibility nearly zero. The Fitzgerald started taking on water. The ship's radar went out, and by late afternoon she was limping blind through one of the worst storms Lake Superior had seen in years. McSorley's voice came through the radio to the Anderson. "We are holding our own." That was the last anyone heard from the Edmund Fitzgerald. At around 7:10 p.m., the Anderson lost radar contact. Just gone. No SOS, no mayday. One moment, a 729-foot ship was there. The next, it wasn't. It would take search crews hours to realize what had happened. The Coast Guard and nearby ships launched rescue efforts through blinding snow. But all they found were lifeboats, smashed, empty, drifting. Not a single man survived. The Edmund Fitzgerald had vanished into 530 feet of water. All 29 crew members were gone, and for years, no one could explain exactly why. Now, here's where things start to get weirdly bureaucratic. The official investigation took 4 years. Because of course it did. Everyone had their own theory. Structural failure, rogue waves, bad maintenance, human error, bad luck, take your pick. Some said the hatch covers weren't properly sealed and water flooded the cargo holds. Others argued that the ship broke in two on the surface, torn apart by massive waves. Then there's the theory that the Fitzgerald hit a shoal, basically, a shallow underwater ridge, and started taking on water long before the storm peaked. In 1976, a Navy underwater camera finally located the wreck split neatly in two. The bow stood upright, buried deep in the mud. The stern was upside down, almost 200 feet away. It looked less like a shipwreck and more like something ripped apart in a single violent motion. The wreck instantly became part of Great Lakes lore and a symbol of how unpredictable the lakes could be. Because it wasn't just that a ship sank, it was that this ship sank. The biggest, strongest, most modern one of its kind. In 1976, Canadian folk singer Gordon Lightfoot released The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. You've probably heard it slow, mournful, the kind of song that gets under your skin. It wasn't just a hit. It became the unofficial memorial for all 29 men who died that night. Lightfoot once said he wrote it because the media had treated the wreck like a passing headline. He wanted people to feel it, And they did. The song hit #2 on the Billboard charts. Imagine that. A 6-minute, fact-based folk song about a shipwreck became one of the biggest hits of the year. But back to the ship herself. The Edmund Fitzgerald rests on the bottom of Lake Superior, about 17 miles north-northwest of Whitefish Point. The water there is icy cold, near freezing year-round. That's why so much of the wreck remains eerily preserved. Divers have visited it over the years, but it's not a place people like to linger. In 1995, the ship's bell was recovered during an authorized dive. It was cleaned, engraved with the names of the 29 lost crewmen, and placed in the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum at Whitefish Point. It's rung every November 10th, once for each man. 50 years later, the wreck still draws researchers, divers, and the kind of people who can't resist a good mystery. But for the families, the story's always been about closure or the lack of it. Because even after all this time, no one can say with absolute certainty what happened in those last few minutes. Some things just disappear too fast to explain. Let's pause here for a moment. Take a slow breath. We're only at the surface of the story. Next, we'll drift deeper into the final voyage, the crew's last hours, and the small choices that sealed the fate of the Edmund Fitzgerald. Hey, again, if you're still with me, go ahead and get a little more comfortable. Maybe pull that blanket up or sip some water. We're heading back to November 10th, 1975. The last hours of the Edmund Fitzgerald, and we're going to move slowly, one wave at a time. By sunrise that day, Lake Superior was already restless. Winds were steady around 40 miles per hour, and the sky had that heavy low gray that promised worse things ahead. Out on the water, two massive ore carriers, the Edmund Fitzgerald and the Arthur M. Anderson, were trying to stay on schedule. Neither of them knew that, within 12 hours, one of them would be gone. Captain Ernest McSorley had been through a lifetime of bad weather. He'd been sailing the Great Lakes for over 40 years, calm, quiet, professional. He didn't talk much, and when he did it was usually practical, no nonsense, which is probably why his crew trusted him so completely. The Fitzgerald was fully loaded with iron ore pellets bound for Detroit. The ship rode low in the water, just 16 feet of freeboard above the surface. That made her more vulnerable to taking on waves, but it was normal for a loaded freighter. Nobody thought much of it. Still, there was something uneasy in the air. The Andersons' first mate, Morgan Clark, later said he felt the wind had a strange cutting sound that morning, a sound sailors recognized as trouble. The two ships had left port the previous evening, taking a route that hugged the north shore of Lake Superior, a common path to stay away from open water. The forecast called for gale warnings, with possible winds up to 60 knots and waves over 20 feet. It wasn't unusual for November, but it wasn't fun either. McSorley radioed the Anderson early that morning. His tone was casual. The storm hadn't hit full force yet. The two ships were keeping visual contact, gray silhouettes against darker gray water. By 10 a.m. that changed. The weather started to deteriorate faster than expected. The National Weather Service upgraded the gale warning to a full-blown storm warning. Waves were climbing higher. Winds were screaming through the rigging, and both ships began slowing down to avoid damage. At 1 p.m. McSorley made his first radio call of concern. The Fitzgerald had lost both of its radar units, likely due to water damage or electrical failure. For a 729-foot freighter in a near whiteout, that was bad news. McSorley told Captain Cooper of the Anderson that he'd have to rely on them for navigational guidance, so the two ships started working as a team. The Anderson stayed about 10 miles behind the Fitzgerald, using radar to track her position and relay bearings through radio. It was an odd moment of maritime trust, two enormous ships, separated by miles of black water and wind, one guiding the other blind through a blizzard. McSorley's calm voice came over the radio again. "I have a fence rail down, 2 vents lost, and a list. I'm taking some heavy seas over the deck." Translated, that meant the Fitzgerald was getting battered. Her deck was damaged. She was leaning slightly to one side, and water was getting in probably faster than the pumps could handle. By late afternoon, things got worse. The storm had intensified beyond the forecast. Wind gusts hit 75 knots, around 85 miles per hour. Waves climbed to 30 feet, some maybe 35. The Anderson's crew later said it felt like trying to drive through a mountain range made of water. Snow squalls came and went, cutting visibility to almost nothing. The lake turned white with foam and spray. Radio chatter grew quiet. Everyone was just trying to survive the next wave. At 5:20 p.m., the Anderson reported 2 massive waves, each over 30 feet high, crashing over their bridge. The captain remarked that those same waves were probably heading straight for the Fitzgerald. Minutes later, McSorley made his final known transmission. "We are holding our own." That was it. Calm, controlled. The kind of thing captains say when things are barely under control. At 7:10 p.m., the Fitzgerald vanished from radar. One moment she was there, a faint blip on the Anderson screen, and the next, gone. The crew of the Anderson tried repeatedly to raise her by radio. No answer. Captain Cooper later said he felt a kind of hollow disbelief. They kept calling for hours, hoping maybe the Fitzgerald had lost power. Maybe she was just out of range. But deep down, everyone knew what had happened. At 9 p.m., The Coast Guard began coordinating a search. The storm was still roaring. The first rescue ships didn't reach the area until after midnight. They found only floating debris, bits of lifeboats, pieces of hatch covers, a few life jackets. Not a single body. It's hard to describe how fast it must have been. Later sonar scans showed that the wreck lay in two main sections, bow and stern, separated by more than 150 feet. That suggested the Fitzgerald broke apart either on the surface or as she plunged downward. Experts think it happened in seconds, maybe less than a minute. One theory says a huge wave combination struck from both sides, cracking the hull. Another theory says the ship had already been weakened by earlier damage and simply couldn't handle the final blow. But the truth is, no one really knows. In the following days, the Great Lakes community was stunned. Ships sank on Superior sometimes. Sure, but not this one. Not a ship that size, that modern, that close to shore. The families waited for answers that didn't come. Many of them had last heard from their loved ones just the day before. Some had even expected them home for the weekend. Newspapers ran with headlines like Fitzgerald lost with 29 men. The owner company tried to reassure the public that it wasn't negligence. The Coast Guard said they'd find out what went wrong, and sailors, they just looked out at the lake and knew that Superior had claimed another one. Over the next few months, investigations, hearings and dives followed. The U.S. Coast Guard, the National Transportation Safety Board, and even the Canadian authorities all launched separate reports. None agreed completely. The Coast Guard's final conclusion in 1977 said that ineffective hatch covers likely caused flooding of the cargo holds. But McSorley's crew had reported taking on water long before that, suggesting something more complex. Other experts believed the ship had run over the 6-fathom shoal, a shallow ridge near Caribou Island, which might have torn open the hull beneath the waterline. The Fitzgerald's course that day had been dangerously close to it. If she struck it, even lightly, she could have been fatally weakened before the storm peaked. Still others argued for the rogue wave theory that a massive set of waves hit the ship broadside, breaking it in half almost instantly. The Anderson's two giant waves, sighted minutes before the Fitzgerald vanished, fit that timeline eerily well. As the official investigations dragged on, the public's attention slowly turned elsewhere, except for one person, Gordon Lightfoot. He'd read a news article that mistakenly called the wreck unimportant that bothered him. So he wrote a song about it, The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. The lyrics came almost straight from the news reports. Names, dates, details. No embellishment. Just a slow, mournful rhythm, like waves rolling endlessly against a hull. The song hit the charts in 1976, less than a year after the disaster. It gave voice to something the headlines hadn't. The humanity of those 29 men, and the quiet terror of being caught in something too big to survive. If you ever visit Whitefish Point today, there's a museum near the shore. The Fitzgerald's recovered bell hangs there now, polished, engraved with all 29 names. Every year, on November 10th, it's rung once for each man. The lake stays quiet during the ceremony, as if listening, because even now, 50 years later, the Edmund Fitzgerald isn't just a shipwreck. It's a story about how even the strongest things can vanish without warning, how a moment of calm we are holding our own can be the last words before silence, and Lake Superior keeps her secrets, always has, always will. If you're still awake, that's impressive. Most people drift off somewhere around the rogue wave theories. But if you're still here, let us keep going because the story of the Edmund Fitzgerald doesn't end when the ship disappears beneath Lake Superior. What came after is a slow unraveling of questions, blame, and the strange way a tragedy becomes myth. The morning after the storm, November 11, 1975, the lake was finally calming. The wind had died down and visibility returned. But the wreckage told a story. Pieces of lifeboats washed up on the shores near Whitefish Bay, shattered and twisted. One was found upside down, its sides bent inward like a crushed can. The name Edmund Fitzgerald was faintly visible on a scrap of wood. The Coast Guard launched aerial searches at first light. They found a long trail of oil on the water, stretching miles. No bodies, no survivors. Just an empty lake that seemed too quiet. In the days that followed, families gathered in Superior, Duluth and Detroit, waiting for news that never came. Some of them clung to the hope that the Fitzgerald might have run aground somewhere remote, or that the crew had managed to launch rafts. But by the third day, everyone knew. 29 men, all gone. The official response was complicated. The U.S. Coast Guard, Canadian authorities, and the ship's owners, Northwestern Mutual and Oglebay Norton, all started their own investigations. And, as often happens, those investigations spent almost as much time arguing with each other as they did finding the truth. The first step was locating the wreck. That took just over 2 weeks. On November 14, 1975, a U.S. Navy aircraft equipped with magnetic sensors detected a large metallic object on the bottom of Lake Superior. About 17 miles from Whitefish Point, a submersible camera, the CURV-3, was deployed shortly after. It sent back the first blurry images of the Fitzgerald resting in the cold dark. Even those early photos told a grim story. The ship was broken in two, the bow upright, the stern upside down. The pieces were 170 feet apart. The middle section where the ship had likely split was just debris. No sign of the crew. No life rafts. Nothing that looked like a chance of survival. The public wanted answers fast. How could something that big, that advanced, vanish so suddenly? The press swarmed the story. Maritime experts appeared on television explaining stress fractures, hatch covers, and wave theory to people who'd never heard of a fathom. Captain McSorley's reputation became part of the debate too. Some papers portrayed him as a hero who fought the storm to the last second. Others implied he'd ignored warnings and pushed his luck. Neither version was fair, but that's what happens when there are no survivors left to speak. The Coast Guard's hearings in 1976 were long and technical. They concluded that the Fitzgerald had likely suffered flooding in the cargo holds due to ineffective hatch closures. Those hatches, 21 in total, covered the massive oar compartments. Each had to be sealed with clamps, and the report suggested they had been fastened tight enough to keep out tons of water crashing over the deck. Not everyone agreed. The Lake Carriers Association, made up of shipping companies and veteran captains, pushed back. They argued that the hatches had passed inspection earlier that season and that it was unlikely all of them failed at once. Another faction pointed to the 6-fathom shoal theory, a shallow ridge near Caribou Island. The Fitzgerald had sailed dangerously close to it within less than a mile during the height of the storm. If her hull scraped bottom there, it could have opened a slow leak that turned catastrophic later. And then came the rogue wave idea. The Great Lakes are famous for them. Massive, sudden walls of water that rise out of nowhere when wind and current collide. The Anderson's crew had reported 2 enormous waves just minutes before the Fitzgerald vanished. If those same waves struck the Fitzgerald broadside or head-on, it could have been enough to snap her in half. By the time all the reports came out, U.S. Coast Guard in 1977, National Transportation Safety Board in 1978, and Canadian inquiries after that, there were 3 official explanations, none of which agreed completely. The Coast Guard blamed flooding through the hatches. The NTSB leaned toward a structural failure under stress. The Canadians believed the ship had struck shoals and was doomed long before nightfall. So basically everyone said it wasn't our fault. Meanwhile, the wreck itself remained a haunting presence. Divers and explorers returned to it again and again, each trying to find new clues. In 1980, a private expedition captured color footage of the ship, confirming much of what the Navy had seen earlier. The bow buried deep in clay, the stern rolled over, and the debris field spread across several hundred feet. Over time, divers also reported seeing human remains preserved by the near-freezing temperatures out of respect for the families. The exact details were kept private, and diving to the site was later restricted. The Canadian government eventually declared the wreck a protected gravesite. One diver who went down in 1989 described the experience as like visiting a cathedral under the sea. The silence, the cold, the immensity, it didn't feel like wreckage. It felt like something watching you back. Through all of this, public fascination never faded. The tragedy had seeped into the cultural fabric of the Great Lakes, and that was largely thanks to Gordon Lightfoot's song. When the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald was released in 1976, it did something strange. It made a commercial hit out of grief. The song wasn't flashy, it didn't even have a chorus. Just a long, rolling ballad, repeating like waves, but it struck a chord. Everyone who'd grown up around the lakes, or known someone who worked them, felt it in their bones. Lightfoot's lyrics were eerily accurate, though he later updated one line when he learned a detail from the Coast Guard report had been wrong. He took that seriously. The song was, to him, sacred ground. It became more than music. It became the memorial. Over the decades, the wreck became part of the region's identity. Students learned about it in school. Artists painted it. Museums dedicated entire wings to it. And every November 10th, people still gather at Whitefish Point for the bell ceremony. The original ship's bell, recovered in 1995, now hangs at the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum. It's engraved with the names of the 29 lost men. Each year, it's rung 29 times, once for each crew member, and one final time for all who've lost their lives on the Great Lakes. If you listen closely in the recordings of that ceremony, you can hear the waves lapping in the background. It sounds like the lake answering back. There's something haunting about the Fitzgerald story that keeps it alive, even now, 50 years later. Maybe it's the lack of closure, no final answer, no survivor's account. Or maybe it's because she sank so close to shore, within sight of safety. Whitefish Bay was just 17 miles away. If she'd lasted another 15 minutes, she might have made it. But she didn't. And that's the part that lingers, the quiet unfairness of it. The lake gave no warning, no mercy. Just a moment of calm, then nothing. Half a century later, the Edmund Fitzgerald rests in the same position, silent, preserved, and undisturbed. The steel hull is coated with sediment, the cargo hold still full of iron ore, and the name on the bow barely visible through the silt. The lake is still cold, still unpredictable, still taking what it wants. And the Fitzgerald story remains a kind of bedtime ghost for anyone who's ever lived near those waters. When you look out over Lake Superior on a gray November evening, it's easy to imagine her out there still, a faint shape on the horizon, holding her own for one last moment. If you're still awake, you've made it further than most. The storm has passed, the investigation's done, and the Fitzgerald now rests in the dark quiet at the bottom of Lake Superior. But even 50 years later, her story hasn't stopped shifting. The wreck might be silent, but the world above her keeps talking. So tonight, let's drift into what came next. The years of dives, debates, and how a single shipwreck turned into one of the Great Lakes' most powerful legends. Let's start in the 1980s. By then, the Fitzgerald had been on the lakebed for less than a decade, but public fascination hadn't faded one bit. New technologies were making it possible to visit the wreck remotely, and sometimes in person. In 1980, the U.S. Navy and the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society teamed up for one of the first detailed photo surveys. They sent down submersibles fitted with cameras, lights, and sonar. What they found confirmed what many already suspected. The ship had broken in two, but not cleanly. The bow was standing upright, the stern inverted, and the midsection had been pulverized by the impact. The images were grainy, green, and haunting. You could see twisted steel beams, the wheelhouse crumpled, and the massive anchor chain still coiled. There was something eerie about how intact parts of it remained, almost like it had sunk in one breath and then been frozen in time. The dives stirred up new arguments. Some experts said the damage proved the ship broke apart as it hit the lakebed, that it hadn't snapped on the surface at all. Others insisted the break had happened above water, caused by structural stress or rogue waves. Each theory came with diagrams, reports, and plenty of finger pointing. But for the families, those details didn't matter as much as one thing: respect. Because as the years went on, more expeditions wanted to visit the wreck, and that became a problem. In the late 1980s, private diving teams began reaching the Fitzgerald using submersibles and deep-sea equipment. Most were respectful. Some weren't. There were stories of divers removing small artifacts, snapping photos of human remains, and even planning documentaries without family consent. That didn't sit well with anyone. The families petitioned both U.S. and Canadian authorities to protect the site. In 1989, the Ontario government declared the wreck off-limits to unauthorized exploration, calling it a gravesite deserving of dignity. From that point forward, only officially sanctioned dives were allowed, mostly for research or memorial purposes. One of those dives, in 1995, became the most famous of all. The Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society, working with the Canadian Navy and the families of the crew, launched an expedition with a single goal: to bring up the Fitzgerald's bell. The idea wasn't just symbolic. The bell had always been the voice of a ship rung during fog, at watch changes, in emergencies. For the families, retrieving it meant giving the crew a voice again. On July 4, 1995, after 2 decades on the bottom, the bell was raised from 530 feet of icy water. Cameras captured the moment it broke the surface, coated in silt, bronze darkened by time. It was cleaned, restored, and engraved with the names of all 29 crew members. Then, a new bell was cast to replace it on the wreck, inscribed simply, "In memory of the men of the Edmund Fitzgerald." That's the one that rests there now, deep under the waves. The original bell hangs in the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum at Whitefish Point. Every November 10th, it's rung 29 times, one for each man, and once more for all lost mariners of the Great Lakes. The 1995 recovery also reignited public curiosity. The footage from the dives aired on television, and for a new generation, the Fitzgerald story came alive again. This time in color video. But the debate over why she sank refused to die. By the 2000s, technology had improved enough for high-resolution sonar mapping of the wreck. These scans revealed new details: microfractures along the hull, twisted deck plates, and evidence that the ship may have struck the bottom bow first, hard enough to bury its nose deep in clay. That detail gave new life to a hybrid theory, that the Fitzgerald might have taken on water through damaged vents or ballast tanks lost stability and then suffered a catastrophic structural failure as she plunged into a trough between massive waves. Essentially, she may have broken apart while already sinking. It was a subtle but important distinction, one that tried to explain both the physical evidence and the speed of her disappearance. Meanwhile, Gordon Lightfoot's song continued to carry the story far beyond the Great Lakes. For many people outside North America, the only reason they'd ever heard of the Edmund Fitzgerald was because of that haunting melody. Lightfoot himself became almost protective of the legacy. In interviews, he spoke softly about it, never performing the song lightly, never turning it into spectacle. In 2010, after reviewing updated Coast Guard findings that cleared some earlier misconceptions, he even changed a lyric out of respect. He replaced the line "at 7 p.m., a main hatchway caved in" with "at 7 p.m. It was nearing the end," acknowledging that the original had unfairly suggested crew error. It was a quiet correction, the kind only someone who truly cared would bother to make. Half a century on, the wreck has become part of the Great Lakes identity, both a warning and a memorial. Mariners still talk about the Fitzgerald when storms roll in. Ship captains pass by Whitefish Point with a moment of silence. Locals in Michigan's Upper Peninsula still say Lake Superior feels different in November. Colder, heavier, like it remembers. Every now and then, you'll hear someone claim to see lights out on the lake on stormy nights, a faint glow moving across the waves where no ship should be. The rational explanation is, of course, reflections or distant freighters. But the locals prefer the other version, that it's the Fitzgerald still sailing, trying to make Whitefish Bay. Because in some stories, the ship never really sinks. There's a quiet kind of poetry in how this tragedy aged. What began as a shocking headline, Fitzgerald lost with 29 men, has softened into something solemn, steady, and strangely comforting. The wreck reminds people that even in an age of steel and radar, nature still has the last word. And maybe that's why the story endures. Not because of the mystery or the song or the photos, but because it feels timeless. The idea that human skill can only go so far against a force that doesn't care how big your ship is or how experienced your captain might be. Lake Superior is still out there, cold and patient. And somewhere beneath her surface lies the Fitzgerald, perfectly preserved by time and temperature. Not gone, just quiet. So if you ever find yourself near Whitefish Point, maybe on a gray November afternoon, take a walk down to the shore. The air will smell like iron and water. The waves will roll slow and heavy. And if you listen long enough, you might catch the faint echo of a ship's bell across the wind. One note for each of the men who went down that night. One note for the captain who said, "We are holding our own." And one final note for the lake itself, still keeping her secrets. If you're still awake, we at the quiet part of the story now, the kind that doesn't make headlines but lingers in memory. The Edmund Fitzgerald story doesn't really end with the investigation or the recovered bell. It continues in the way people remember her in museums, in songs, and in the cold November wind that still sweeps across Lake Superior. Let's start with that phrase, the lake that never gives up her dead. It's more than poetry, it's chemistry. Lake Superior. Water is so cold, rarely rising above 4 degrees Celsius even in summer, that it prevents the usual decomposition that brings bodies back to the surface. The pressure and the temperature combine to preserve rather than release. That's why, even 50 years later, none of the Fitzgerald's 29 crew members have ever been recovered. They remain there, sealed in time, watched over by darkness and silt. Divers who've glimpsed the wreck describe it as peaceful, almost reverent, like the lake itself decided to keep them close. For many Great Lakes sailors, the Fitzgerald isn't just a story, she's a reminder. When storms rise suddenly, or when radar glitches out in rough weather, someone on the bridge almost always says it. Remember the Fitz. It's not superstition, it's respect, because the Great Lakes Superior especially are inland seas. They have moods, they breathe, they change, and they can turn violent without warning. And the Fitzgerald, despite being one of the biggest, strongest, most advanced freighters of her time, showed that no one is immune to the lake's temper. Whitefish Point, where the Fitzgerald was trying to reach that night, has become a kind of pilgrimage site. The Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum there is small and quiet, surrounded by pine and mist. The Fitzgerald's bell hangs in a glass case near the center. People stand before it longer than you'd expect. Some are tourists, some are sailors, some are children of the men who never came home. Every year on November 10th, at exactly 7:10 p.m., they gather for the memorial service. The bell is rung 29 times, once for each crewman, and once more for all others lost on the Great Lakes. Outside, the wind usually picks up. The lake looks steel gray, the same color it must have been that night in 1975. You can almost hear the waves through the trees. And then there's the song. Gordon Lightfoot's The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald came out just a year after the tragedy, and it's still played on northern radio stations every November. Lightfoot managed to capture what no report or documentary ever could, the human side of it. The lyrics don't just tell a story, they feel like the storm itself. They rise and fall like waves. They name the lake, the men, and the helplessness of watching something so massive vanish in a blink. When Lightfoot passed away in 2023, radio stations across the Great Lakes replayed that song on loop. For many listeners, it wasn't just a tribute to him, it was another chapter in the Fitzgerald's long echo. 50 years later, technology still tries to solve what the storm erased. Sonar scans, computer simulations, 3D reconstructions, each one promises new insight. But in truth, none of them change what happened. A storm came, a ship went down, and the lake decided to keep her. Some mysteries are best left unwrapped because part of what gives the Fitzgerald its weight, the science, the silence. Think about this. In 1975, the Edmund Fitzgerald was considered nearly unsinkable. She was a modern steel freighter with a strong reputation and a seasoned captain. Yet, when the storm hit, technology, training, and experience all folded in minutes. It's a reminder that nature doesn't need to be cruel to be powerful. Sometimes, all it takes is wind, waves, and a little bad luck. And maybe that's why people still feel connected to this story. Because it's not just about a shipwreck, it's about vulnerability. About the smallness of human confidence against something bigger, colder, older. In the end, the Fitzgerald's legacy isn't one of tragedy alone. It's about endurance, of memory, of respect, and of storytelling. The lake still guards the ship, the families still keep the names, the bell still rings each November, and the song still drifts over late-night radio, reminding everyone that history can be both heavy and beautiful. And somewhere, deep beneath the surface, 530 feet down, the Edmund Fitzgerald still rests, her bow upright, her stern torn away, her decks quiet, still holding her own. If you're still with me, half asleep maybe, wrapped up and listening to the hum of this story, we've reached the part where the waves have gone quiet. The ship is long gone, the storm has passed, but somehow the Edmund Fitzgerald never really left, because some stories refuse to sink, they just drift, quietly, through decades. In the years after the wreck, the Fitzgerald became more than a ship. She became a symbol not of failure, but of the strange bond people form with tragedy, especially in places where the water is never far away. Around the Great Lakes, everyone knew someone who worked on a freighter. Fathers, brothers, cousins, men who lived on the water half the year. So when the Fitzgerald went down, it wasn't just a headline, it was personal. It was close. Newspapers called it the Titanic of the Great Lakes. That's not entirely accurate. The scale was smaller, but the emotion was the same. Shock, loss, and then a strange need to make sense of it all. And so, as people do, they started to build meaning. Some blamed design flaws, said the ship's hull was too rigid, her hatches too weak. Others blamed the storm. Others blamed the Coast Guard for closing off Whitefish Bay's beacon too soon. And then, of course, there were the myths. Stories spread of ghost lights on the lake, of distant radar echoes, of a song that could be heard through the fog. All of it unprovable, all of it very human, because when something huge disappears, silence feels unbearable. We fill it with stories. A few survivors of other shipwrecks on Superior have said they've dreamed of the Fitzgerald. They never saw her sink, but they dream of her gliding under the surface, still upright, still lit, like she's sailing through the cold dark beneath. It's eerie, but comforting too. The idea that maybe the men aboard her are still doing what they did best, running the ship, watching the radar, listening to the wind howl across the decks. There's something timeless about that image. A ghost ship, still at work, endlessly crossing an underwater horizon. But here's the part people forget. The Fitzgerald was a working ship, not a cruise liner or a symbol of pride. She hauled iron ore, day in and day out, for 17 years. She was a machine of commerce, not romance. And yet, 50 years later, we talk about her as if she were a living thing. We say she was her final voyage. We talk about her courage, her fate. It's a reminder that humans are storytellers first, engineers second. We can't help giving emotion to steel, purpose to coincidence, and meaning to tragedy. Even the wreck site itself has become part of this strange afterlife. After the initial dives in the 1990s, it was decided no more human visits would be made to the site. It's now considered a grave site, a place of rest. No more cameras, no more dives. Instead, it's been digitally mapped, preserved in sonar scans and 3D models. Cold data to represent something deeply emotional. The bell, the only artifact brought to the surface, sits in the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum, polished and silent most of the year. But every November, it rings again. That's how people grieve when they can bring the lost home. They build rituals, they turn memory into music. And music, somehow, did what no report or documentary ever could. Gordon Lightfoot's song made the wreck eternal. He took the technical details, the times, the names, the weather, and wrapped them in something hauntingly beautiful. The song moves like the lake itself, slow, heavy, and unstoppable. It became the unofficial national anthem of the Great Lakes region. People play it in bars, in boats, at memorials, even in classrooms. Its history turned into melody. And every time those words play, the legend lives on from the Chippewa on down. It's a reminder that legends are made not just from what happened, but from what people choose to remember. Half a century later, the Edmund Fitzgerald remains one of those rare events where everything, nature, technology, and humanity, collided in perfect, tragic alignment. No one's to blame, not entirely. The lake did what it always does. The ship did what it was built to do, and people, as always, tried to make sense of something senseless. Maybe that's what gives the story its strange peace. It's not about the violence of the storm, it's about what remains afterward. The quiet, the respect, the endurance of memory. So now, as we close this long drift through time, picture the Edmund Fitzgerald not as a broken ship in the dark, but as part of the lake itself, settled, timeless. Above her, the waves rise and fall, just as they did that night. And every November, when the wind picks up and the sky turns steel gray, it's as if the lake whispers her name back to the shore, not as tragedy, but as remembrance. Well, that's kind of impressive. Most people drift off somewhere between the radar failure and the bell ringing. But if your eyes are still open, let's let this last part roll over you like a soft wave. This isn't really the end, more like the long quiet after the thunder fades. The storm that swallowed the Edmund Fitzgerald ended in less than a night, but its echo has lasted 50 years. And maybe that's what this story has always been about. Not the wreck itself, but the echo it left behind. When you stand by Lake Superior, even on a calm day, you can feel something heavy in the air. It's not sadness exactly, more like awareness. The lake looks endless, smooth, dark, indifferent, and you realize that everything humans build, ships, machines, reputations, is small compared to this. That's what the Fitzgerald teaches us, in her quiet, wordless way, that sometimes being powerful isn't enough, that control is always an illusion, and that beauty and danger can share the same horizon. You can't see her from shore, of course. The Fitzgerald rests deep about 530 feet down in a part of the lake where sunlight doesn't reach. No coral reefs, no colorful fish, just cold, clear water, silt, and silence. The bow still stands upright, proud as ever. The stern is torn away, scattered. The decks are empty, but undisturbed. The men aboard, all 29, remain there, part of the lake now, a crew without a clock, without a shift to end. If you wanted to romanticize it, you could say they're still sailing, still working their way toward Whitefish Bay, one calm night at a time, and maybe, in some way, that's true. There's something humbling about how we humans mark tragedy. We build memorials, we tell stories, we ring bells. But the lake just keeps moving. It doesn't hold grudges. It doesn't explain itself. It doesn't change. The same winds that sank the Fitzgerald still roll across the surface every autumn. The same fog drifts in. The same distant light from the Whitefish Point lighthouse flashes every few seconds, as if still guiding ships that will never arrive. It's eerie and beautiful the way history never really leaves. It just waits quietly for someone to remember. Every year, when November 10th comes around, the Great Lakes communities slow down a little. The museum at Whitefish Point fills with people. Fishermen hang their heads. Old captains stand still during the bell ceremony. 29 tolls. Then one final ring for all souls lost on the Great Lakes. And for a few minutes, everyone there feels the same thing, a mix of grief, pride, and peace. The kind of peace that doesn't come from answers but from acceptance. You know, it's strange for a ship that sank in the middle of nowhere, with no survivors, no witnesses, and no final message. The Edmund Fitzgerald might be the most vividly remembered vessel in modern history. That says something about us, about how we find meaning in what's gone. Because when you tell a story long enough, when you speak a name year after year, that thing never really disappears. So maybe the Fitzgerald isn't gone at all. Maybe she's right where she was meant to be, part of the lake, part of the wind, part of the song that never stops playing. If you ever visit Lake Superior on a calm night, try listening. You'll hear waves slapping the rocks, low and steady. You'll hear wind moving through the pines. And if you close your eyes, you might almost hear the slow, deep sound of a ship's horn, carried across the water from somewhere just out of sight. That's where the story of the Edmund Fitzgerald really lives, in the quiet spaces between what we know and what we imagine. A half-remembered song, a name carved into a bell, a light blinking on a cold horizon, and a reminder that even the strongest steel has to surrender, eventually, to the sea. So tonight, as we let this story settle, think of the Fitzgerald not as a shipwreck, but as a memory still afloat, heavy, beautiful, and unbroken by time. She went down in one night, but she never really disappeared. Sleep well, and may your waters stay calm.